So, Chris, we're going to get to blockchain in just a moment, but I want to start first with your childhood. Where did you
Mhm.
grow up? And what was your first experience with the internet?
I grew up in Ohio in a sort of a smallish town called Springfield, Ohio, and my parents were professors, English professors at the local university called Wittenberg. And I got into computers really early. I was given a kind of an older computer and started programming and got really into it. And then even in the sort of late 80s, got into the internet a little bit because my parents were academics and they had these, for those who know the history of the internet, it began with school universities and it was text based. You had to type, but you could if you were into programming, you could download programs and
Mm.
talk. There was this thing called Usenet, which was sort of like forums or discussion groups for technical topics. And then the 90s, of course, as most people who lived through that era, I got very excited about it. And I eventually, of course, I've now spent my career working on the internet. But in the 90s, I think I really fell in love with the idea that it was, that the internet is this, I sort of see it as inevitable that we would have connected all the computers in the world. Once you have computers, why don't you connect them? Like all science fiction does that. And it just seems like an obvious thing to do. But the way that we connected them as a kind of decentralized community-owned network was to me really exciting and interesting. You could have imagined an alternative history where sort of the internet was controlled by AOL or some other big company. And so that was really, to me, it felt like, and I think we saw this as sort of a golden period in the 90s and some 2000s of innovation, entrepreneurship, as a kind of flywheel for creativity and
Mm.
entrepreneurship, I guess is what really excited me about the internet.
How
And
old were
then
you when all this was happening, Chris? Were you like
I was
10,
in my
12?
20s. Yeah, I was in
Oh,
20, no, sorry, in the 90s, I was in my 20s. Yeah. So
yeah. Okay.
I was I finished college in 95.
Mhm.
And so, so then I worked a little bit professionally as a programmer and then discovered the world of entrepreneurship.
Mm.
And that for
Mm.
me, that was kind of a revelation that you could, you could start a company and, work with great people and create
Mm.
products and just all these exciting things. And it's sort of, just kind of just exciting, sort of risk taking.
Yeah.
And that I fell in love with that. So.
It is interesting. Okay, so one thing that you just said that I want to ask you, did you have a favorite science fiction or fantasy book as a child that was sort of capturing your
Yeah.
imagination as you were
Uh,
thinking about, because your parents are English professors,
yeah.
maybe you read a lot, you've got the internet, but what was happening in young Chris's brain that was capturing your imagination?
I really liked, so I think that I really liked programming computers.
Mm.
I think that programming is sometimes misunderstood as sort of pure engineering.
Mm.
I think of it as a much more creative activity. And
Mm.
so I would sit around, and I think if you talk to people who got into it young, they also would say that. And so for me, it was kind of my canvas to be creative. And so I would, come up with ideas of I would make games and fun apps and come up with ways to build them and work with my friends on it. And it was just, it was like Legos or I don't know, something like it was
Mhm.
just this really kind of, for me, it felt creative. And so I really fell in love with that. In terms of books, I used to read very much into science. I ended up studying philosophy in college because I got interested in kind of cognitive science and AI
Mm. Mm.
and philosophy of mind and logic. There were some books that were really influential on me. Like there's a sort of philosopher named Daniel Dennett and a guy, a computer scientist named Douglas Hofstadter. And Hofstadter wrote this book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, which was probably the most influential book on me, which was about kind of the commonalities between Bach, the composer,
Mhm.
Gödel, the mathematician, and Escher, the artist, and
Mm.
just sort of I guess ideas, things. I mean, I also read a lot of science fiction, like Ray Bradbury. I love Foundation, Isaac Asimov. I don't know, I was into that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, but more,
So
I would
have
say
you
more
seen Yeah,
philosophy, science fiction. Sorry.
got it. Have you seen Dune 2 yet? That's the
I
question.
haven't. I'm going with my son tomorrow. We got tickets in the IMAX, so I'm excited for that. I got to
Yeah,
hear his
yeah,
take.
yeah. All right. So you said that your imagination's captured, you're reading, you're creating, this is a very social activity for you. And then you discover that you can become an entrepreneur and build a business. Can you just tell us about one of your first entrepreneurial adventures? Well,
Yeah.
ventures and adventures.
Yeah.
What did you do? What was your ideation process?
Yeah, it's funny. So I discovered this sort of a little, I mean, toward the end of the dot-com bubble kind of era. So around 1990, I mean, I'd been working as an engineer, but then I said, I'm going to do it myself. And I tried to do a few things that were kind of bootstrapped. I built this software product called, so when phishing started, um, Fishing, PH fishing,
Oh
so
yeah. I was like,
yeah,
wait,
sorry.
what kind
No,
of
sorry.
fishing? Okay,
Yeah,
PHISH.
yeah, not in the
When you
water.
started fly fishing.
But in sort of like early 2000s, people started getting these emails, like fake
Mhm.
PayPal emails. And so me and my friend created, we didn't have any money or venture capital, but we just did it, with ourselves. And we hired a few people like with our savings. And we created a product that was called Fraud Eliminator that was basically would detect phishing and block it.
Hmm.
And that actually did reasonably well. And then as I was thinking about it, I was like, why am I just blocking phishing? And why not block spyware? And there were all these bad problems. The internet was kind of worse back then. And like
Mhm.
if somebody has a fraudulent pharmacy or something, like some crazy, bad stuff on the internet, why don't
Mhm.
we block that too? And that actually led me to end up raising venture capital and starting a company that was transformed into this company called Site Advisor, which was really my first genuine startup, which was it's basically a tool, like you download this toolbar and it would overlay on search results and in websites. And it would basically give you a big red warning if you're about to do something bad. But in order to do that, it was hard. We had to go and like crawl the web and analyze websites and do all this. So we did a lot of work to get the right ratings.
Mhm.
And that was early 2000s. That was my first sort of real startup, and we ended up getting acquired by McAfee, the large security
Yeah.
company, in 2006. So that was my
So,
real kind of entrepreneurial beginning.
well, yeah. When you say real though, it's like that's my real first job, but you'd had like part-time jobs for 5-10 years leading up
Yeah,
to that. It sounds,
yeah. I've been
kind of like
thinking
I
about
was
it.
a cook, I was a server,
Yeah.
I was, I delivered papers. Um, what's a lesson that you learned from starting Site Advisor around building a business, around working with people that you still carry with you today?
Well, I think you as you're much deeper on this topic than me and write about it. I think that sort of the team, I mean, this is almost a cliche, but it's very true, is that the team is
Mhm.
everything. And so and to this day, spend 50% of my time kind of finding people to work with and
Mhm.
recruiting people. But one thing you learn when you're an entrepreneur is you just end up, especially when you're in an early stage, you just end up pitching over and over and over. Meaning, first you pitch your VCs to raise money, and then you start. And I was like, great, I'm done pitching. I'm done
Mhm.
saying the same hour-long speech.
Mhm.
And then I started recruiting employees, and then I started recruiting partners, and then I started explaining it to the press. And it's just like I just did the same. It was just basically I was just constantly going out and trying to,
Mhm.
sort of like you're just trying to kind of create a movement in a way.
Mhm.
And you really need, and especially that early core. Like we ended up we only had about 15-20 people when we were acquired, but they were really, really good. They've all
Mhm.
gone on to do interesting stuff. Some of them actually started another company with. So really spent, like, it was in Boston, and we'd go. This was like the internet was out of fashion, and we'd go over to MIT, and we would just
Mhm.
like go to I would literally just sit down at the lunch table and just start meeting people and then like recruiting
Really?
people. Oh yeah. I was
Mm.
like, it was
Mm.
just all about the people. And then I heard so and so was really smart, and then I'd go just like visit that person and start talking to them. And I saw it all as like a multi-year, like a few of the best people I got out of MIT probably took me a year and a half of just constant, going back. I've learned a lot of recruiting, I think, has to be kind of outbound. Like
Yeah.
you really just go, especially in these early stage startups. Like I just sort of like, who are the best people in the world, and how do I go find them?
Mm.
And it's it's just transformative if you take that approach. That's one.
Yeah.
Look, there's many lessons from startups.
Okay.
That's a
So,
big one.
so Chris, one of the things that's really interesting for me is I'm thinking about in your book, and I know we're talking about, protocol networks and corporate networks and blockchain networks, and we'll get to that in just a second. But something you just said, which was really powerful, about how you went about recruiting people, that you would just go over to MIT and start talking to people and meeting people. In your book, on page 17, with the Roman numeral 17, you say, pause for a moment. Social networks, whether in person or online, are the essence of human connection and coordination. It's fascinating to me how you're living that online, but you are absolutely living that out in your in-person world. Interesting to observe that.
It's a very interesting point, because as much as I am, obviously an internet person, if you want to talk about, we could. Like I thought the whole COVID experience was interesting. Where I at first I thought, okay, now we can live in this remote world and do
Mm.
everything from Zoom, and people can live wherever they want. I've come full swing back to realizing, to believing it's very hard to make work, and that ultimately there's no replacement for in-person human connection.
Well, it's interesting. There was an article, I think it was in Nature not too long ago, that said that you can do a lot of sustaining innovations, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but a lot of sustaining innovations with remote work, but the breakthrough, the real disruptive innovations happen with in-person work. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think it's the sort of the creativity, the serendipity. There's that aspect, the sort of intellectual aspect, and then the emotional aspect, right? It's very hard to, I mean, you can sustain, like I have people on my team who I worked with in person for years, and now we work on Zoom, and that's fine. But would we ever have built that original relationship over Zoom, right? I don't know.
Fascinating. Okay, let's go to your book. But before we have you talk about the book, I want to read the very first epigraph of the book as an introduction to this topic. So this is from Freeman Dyson. And the book's obviously, actually, since we've got video, it's Read, Write, Own. It is a terrific book, everybody. Here's your first epigraph. When the great innovation appears, it will almost certainly be in a muddled, incomplete, and confusing form. To the discoverer, it will only be half understood. To everybody else, it will be a mystery. For any speculation which does not at first glance look crazy, there is no hope. So with that in mind, I would love for you to talk about the transformative power or potential of blockchain and really break it down for those of us who are smart and educated, but don't know much about this.
Yeah. So I would say a couple of things. So with respect to that quote, I think I have the part in the book where I talk about what I believe are two types of innovations. And I call one type inside out and the other outside in. And the idea is that, and this especially applies to software and computers, that there are certain innovations that are inside out, meaning they come from established institutions. So AI, or smartphone is a good example. Apple, made the iPhone, and then Google made Android, and then it sort of propagated out from those established institutions. AI has been something that's been developed for decades at universities and big corporate research centers. There are also outside in, and that's where I've spent my career. So one, I think, really important example of outside in is open source software. So open source software began as an 80s, like kind of a radical political movement, as a bunch of people that didn't believe in copyright, but then transformed into a pragmatic technology movement. And today, something on the order of 95+% of software that runs in the world is open source software. People may not know that, but like Linux is by far the dominant operating system in the world. Every Android phone runs Linux. Every backend software runs Linux, new devices. And so open source software, had you sort of looked at it in the 90s to the Freeman Dyson quote, you'd say, what is this? This is like a bunch of people on the internet with no company behind them, no product managers, and they're trying to build an operating system to take on Windows. Like, it's weird, right? Now, if you analyzed it and you really understood it and you spent the time, you'd realize, well, okay, so they're chaotic and it's less organized, but they also have the ability to tap into all of humanity, right? Anyone in the world who's smart can come and can add a little piece to it. And so it's like basically software ends up being like Lego bricks, and you can assemble them and build bigger things. And when you have, 8 billion people with access to those Lego bricks, magic happens, right? And so I've spent my career kind of looking at these kind of weird outside in innovations and trying to understand them and make sense of them. And that's what my book is about with respect to blockchain. So I think blockchains are like open source software, and that they came from the fringes. They began, very fringe, a pseudonymous white paper in 2008 by this character, Satoshi Nakamoto, was sort of the original idea. This on Bitcoin was where the original idea of blockchains came. And then today, it's really dumb. It's a global movement. It's hackers around the world. Much of it happens outside of established companies. And so, I've spent the last decade in that world full time for the last 5 years, and thinking about, sort of making sense of it. And in this book, I try to share what I've learned and help others make sense of it. So a very simple way to think of it, I think, is blockchains allow you to create a new internet services where there's no gatekeeper. And so what do I mean by that is you take an internet service like Facebook, there's a gatekeeper, meaning the company Facebook. And what that means is they get both most of the money, meaning, so Facebook, the top 5 social networks last year made $150 billion in revenue. And they kept that revenue, even though the people that do the work on those social networks are the users. You don't go to Facebook or TikTok or Instagram to see, Facebook's content or TikTok's content. You go to see other users. So they were very cleverly designed systems where by being the gatekeeper, they get all the money, or the vast majority of the money. And they also get control. They can change the algorithm. They can remove people. They can do what they want, right? Blockchains will let you make social networks, games, financial services, whatever you might want to, any kind of internet service that you might use today, but do it in a way where instead of being owned by a company and having a gatekeeper, it's owned by a community. And I go through in the book, in the first sort of part of the book, I walk through the history of the internet, because this might sound like a radical idea, but it's actually how the internet began. The internet began with community-owned systems. The World Wide Web is a system built on top of the internet that has no owner, has no gatekeeper. And I argue in the book that having no gatekeeper led to vastly better economics and incentivized innovation, incentivized creativity. But that over time, as the internet has become more consolidated around these big tech companies, we've lost a lot of that. So sort of the first half of the book kind of diagnoses the history, that go through the history and diagnoses what happened. I think that part is probably less controversial. It's sort of, I think it's, internet veterans, I think, would generally agree with that first half. In the second half, I offer my prescription for how to fix that. That might be more controversial, and it involves blockchains, which are controversial. And I explain in detail how they might fix that, and then go through in detail a bunch of applications like social networks and games and other things, and explain how those might work.
So can you, one of the things I thought you did just such a beautiful job of just giving a simple, and you've kind of touched on this, but the difference between a corporate network, a protocol network, and a blockchain network, and maybe use the analogy of the city, because that
Sure.
everybody understands the construction and the architecture of a city, and talk about that at a high level to help people say, okay, I'm following you. I get the idea of agency that comes with a blockchain network, but help me understand what that looks like.
Yeah. So maybe just quickly on definitions, and then I'll jump into the city. So protocol networks. So the internet began with what are called protocols. I call them protocol networks, which are the email and the World Wide Web. So these are systems that are built on top of the internet. People sometimes use the web synonymous with the internet. It's not. It's a system on top. When you go to your browser and go to a website, that you're using that system. And the key feature of that system is there's no intermediary. There's no gatekeeper. You're going directly to, right? It's sort of I think of it as a public space. You're in a public space, and you can build a private space. So when I go to google.com, I'm now in Google's sort of private space, but the web itself is a public space, much like city streets. So this is where the sort of city analogy comes. Like, I'm in New York City right now, and I love New York City. I've lived a long time in New York City, and I love New York City because I think it has a wonderful balance between the public and private space. The parks, there's open streets, and then of course there's also the private space, which means there's entrepreneurship, there's a pizza shop, there's a chess shop, right? It's a bookstore, and I think if those two reinforce each other, right? Like the fact that there's public space generates foot traffic, and the foot traffic allows the entrepreneur to build a pizza shop, right? And I think that, and the city is very good at doing the public things, like ensuring the streets are safe and open and free and clean and free, by the way, not you don't charge for them, like it's and the parks and everything else. And then I would argue the private sector is very good at the other thing, which is sort of coming up with a new type of restaurant. Like, I don't think that would be something the public sector would be very good at. And so it's got a nice balance. The other key feature of a city is it's bottoms up. The successful cities. There have been a lot of attempts to plan cities, but if you look at the great cities, France, Paris, London, they grew from the people, right? They have mayors, and policy is very important. I'm not dismissing that, but ultimately the energy and the creativity came from the bottom, kind of organically, right? They're almost these sort of organic structures. And I think of the early internet as being very much like that. So the World Wide Web, I go to Google and I'm sort of walking on public streets. There's no one standing in between me and Google. There's a whole bunch of a lot of the 90s internet, sort of early internet, was sort of these public networks. And then you'd have sort of areas, you'd put a nonprofit, an artist might make a website, a business might make a website, and you can do whatever you want, just like a city. I mean, there's laws and rules and things, but within the laws, you can do what you want, right? You can create things. And you own a little plot of land, when you own, I own cdixon.org, and that's my plot of land, and I can put up art, or I can do this. And look, if I decide, if I have an audience, I truly own that audience. No one can insert an algorithm in between and take it away the way they can on a social network. I can choose to charge them for a subscription, and if they do, I get all the money. That doesn't happen on these big social networks. And then fast forward to today, I think of it much more, I analogize it in the book to theme parks. I like theme parks, they're fun. I don't think we'd want the world to be built that way, where a single company controls the entire experience end to end. But that is what we live in today. We have basically an internet now. There's 5 companies that control 95% of the traffic and the money. And I worry that, AI is an amazing invention, and I think will be very important, and I'm pro AI, but I do think it will tend to further consolidate the internet because it rewards companies with large troves of data and capital. So I worry that we've kind of lost a lot of what made the internet great. And I started feeling this way about 10 years ago. I go through it in the book. I think that's when the real reversal happened and things started to really trend this way. And I was working on the sort of obviously on sort of traditional internet companies and things. So I was sort of part of the problem in a sense. But at some point realized this, I don't think this is headed in the right direction. And then I discovered the world of blockchains. And to me, this is a potential antidote.
Yeah. So it's interesting when I hear you describe this and the idea of, do you really want to live in a theme park all the time? Like it is fun, but you don't have control over it. And there's something really important and fundamental of what you're talking about, which goes to agency, this idea of allowing people to be agentic. And the internet that you grew up with, it allowed for agency and this sense of controlling your own destiny. I mean, you can't control, there's a lot that you can't control, but there's just a greater sense of agency. And while Facebook and Google are all fun, like you said, a theme park, but there's an element of, if you surrender your life to that, you're surrendering some agency and sense of deciding what you want the world to look like. So
yeah, I think so. I think you lose agency. I think you also, I believe, I'm a big fan of, I read a lot of history, and I read a lot of history of innovation, and a lot of innovation, I believe, comes from kind of the fringes. I mean, there's a reason the Wright brothers, had a bicycle shop, and they weren't in the, there's just sort of, and computer science, software has a long history. Steve Jobs and Wozniak were flip-flop wearing hackers at the Homebrew Computer Club, right? Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, was a physicist at CERN. None of these people came from central casting. And I worry, I'll just say a very, very practical example, which is the Apple App Store is now the gatekeeper, and they kick out a lot of apps, and this is not just kind of blockchain. This is throughout our firm as a venture capital firm. It's a major issue that if they don't like the app, they just kicked Epic, the maker of Fortnite, out because they didn't like a tweet of theirs.
Wow.
This just happened last week. There's a lawsuit going on between Epic and then the more kind of dramatic thing is they take 30% of the money, and they just have sort of this chokehold, right? And I think, look, the tax they take, the 30%, is one thing. I worry more about, you think about the early web browser that my partner Mark Andreessen created, Netscape, in the 90s. That was a pretty radical invention at the time. Anyone could go anywhere. Look, you could make a bad website. You could make it was a permissionless system, right? I worry that stuff like that would be banned by the App Store, that wouldn't be allowed today. And you obviously need guardrails around. I'm not an advocate for full laissez-faire, no rules internet, but sometimes these things start off at the edges and they're weird, and there's some issues, and then you kind of fix the issues. And I just worry that we're entering an era where these sort of 5 companies just have so much control, and that we'll lose creativity, innovation, and, as you say, agency.
Yeah. Yeah. So 2 more quotes from the book that I loved. Network design, the way nodes connect, interact, and form an overarching structure, is the single most relevant factor in determining rights and money distributed. And then you said network design determines outcome, which reminds me of a wonderful W. Edwards Deming quote, which I'm going to paraphrase because I'm not going to get it right. But basically, a system is designed to get exactly the result that you get. So what is it that you want? So could you, before we move to asking you to share a practical example, so if there's one or two things that you want people to say, okay, I just listened to Chris talk. I understand blockchain better now. What are two things that you would have them take away that they could repeat to someone? Like, what is blockchain? What would those be repeatable phrases that you could give?
I think well, I would say a couple. I would say one way to think of blockchains is it enables you to build internet services sophisticated advanced internet services without gatekeepers that are owned by communities and not by companies. Maybe that would be my simple explanation.
Yep.
And then I would say on the systems mentioned on the book, I mean, I think with respect to network design, I think my broader point there would be, when you think about most people have a pretty good your listeners, I assume, have a pretty good understanding about how the world works. They understand, yes, economics. They, they understand, unemployment, inflation. Like these are sort of technical terms at one point in economics. They know what they are. They understand how companies work. I think a lot of people, even educated people who aren't in the technology business, sort of treat the internet like a black box. Like they don't, and I would say what my book tries to do, and is peer behind the black box and say, specifically how does power and money work on the internet? Like, how do you accrue power and money on the internet? How did that happen historically? What are the rules of the game, so to speak? And you can, even if you disagree with my prescription for how to solve it, I would argue that first half of the book of like the diagnosis of how power and money works, I think that should be a more mainstream discussion. Like, I think people should be aware of that, should be discussing it. And, maybe the answer is what I propose, like a new set of internet services. Maybe there's a policy answer, but I think that we should be having that discussion. So that would be the other kind of thing I'd hope people take away.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So as a practical matter, you said you've got some prescriptions of what you would do. I would love to hear your thoughts on how could blockchain disrupt an industry or disrupt in a way that's really easy for listeners to understand.
Yeah, so we have one example, and is social networking as an example. That's important because people spend something on the order of 7 hours a day on the internet, and 2.5 hours or so of social networking. So it's the most popular category. It's also a giant business. It's 150 billion in revenue. There's a bunch of which we're investors in. Some of them. There's a new wave of social networks that are built on blockchains, and the key feature is that so you think about Twitter. I'm on Twitter and I have the handle Dixon. Okay. And I have an audience on Twitter. And if I don't like what Elon Musk is doing or how they change the algorithm or how they change the economics, I'm kind of stuck there. Right. If I leave, I have to start over. I built that audience over a long time. I think you have a huge LinkedIn following, right? Hopefully LinkedIn treats you well, but if you don't like it, too bad. They own it.
Right.
Contrast that with how email works. I don't know if you have a Substack or a MailChimp email list and you don't like what that provider's doing, you can switch and take your audience with you.
Got it.
So the blockchain-based social networks work like email and not like Facebook. The user is in control. The user owns their name, their handle, they own their audience. There are software providers. You can download a piece of software. There's different, just like with the web browsers, you can choose to use Chrome or Safari but if you don't like what the software does, if they change the algorithm or they take your money or something else you don't like, you can switch, right? And just that one little design, and that is enabled by blockchain. Yeah, that's enabled by blockchain. So it's like you get all the good things of TikTok and all the modern graphics and all the other kinds of stuff, but you can switch. And that one thing, I would argue, that one thing of being able to switch shifts all of the power, not all the power, but a lot of the power back to the user. Yeah. Right. And if they charge too much money or they do whatever, you can switch. So that's something I'm very excited about. And then you can sort of take that pattern and apply it to games and financial services and whatever it might be.
Okay, so I know that compliance is listening to this, but is there? So when you think about these new social platforms on blockchain, because I'm finding myself, I'm really curious. Like you said, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm sort of on Instagram. Not on Twitter so much anymore. So my question for you is, what are some of these new social networking platforms that you're excited about that you can talk about, or you have to disclose that you're invested in?
No, I mean, we're investors in one it's called Farcaster. It's there's a few. It's small. It's like a few 100,000 users. I mean, it's only been around for a relatively short period of time, but it's nice. I mean, you could download it now, and it feels just like it works just like a sort of a Twitter type thing, but
Hmm.
there are many different clients. So there's one called Warpcast that's popular. There's other, meaning when I say clients, you can switch software,
Yeah.
as an example. So that's one, and I think they've done a really nice job. It's these things will take time.
Yeah.
But one of the challenges with blockchains is they kind of like all computing. It's just taken time to get the kind of underlying infrastructure good enough. I think we're finally there now. So that's why we're seeing, as of the last year or so, things like what I'm describing.
Yeah.
And so then it will take time. So like I would say the product is working well. They've got a good user base, but the internet's now 5 billion people. So
Right.
it's going to take time to build these things up to be mainstream.
Well, again, but this is just like the adoption curve, which, I know you love S curves as I do. You're at the launch point for a long time, and then suddenly you hit the tipping point. And so you're saying lots of growth is happening. It's not yet apparent, but at some point it will be.
I hope so, and I believe so, but
yeah. So can you just talk briefly about the connection between Bitcoin, Ethereum, and blockchain? What's that constellation look like?
Yeah, maybe I'll just give a quick history. So there was this pseudonymous white paper about Bitcoin that came out in late 2000, and in that paper it described essentially a financial service, a payment system that had no gatekeeper. That was just it just existed and was owned by the kind of community. And in part of that, as part of that paper, it described kind of how the system works, and that has come to be called, how the system works has come to be called a blockchain. A blockchain it's a computer. I think of it as a computer. So what is a computer? If you go back to sort of Alan Turing and the early computing discussions, a computer is something you write software for that can run code and can store information, right? That's what your laptop does. That's what your phone does. A computer doesn't have to be a device. There's a whole history of things called virtual computers that are computers that run on other systems. So a blockchain I think of as a virtual computer. So you can write code for it and you can run that code. It happens to be a computer that runs on a network of other computers, and it does that. I can explain because one of the key features of a blockchain is that it can make strong commitments about the future. I call blockchains computers that can make commitments. So why is Bitcoin different than if Chris Dixon puts up if Google said, I'm going to create a Google coin and I'm going to compete with Bitcoin. Okay. And they said there's only ever going to be 21 million Google coins. Bitcoin also says there's only going to be 21 million Bitcoins. The difference is with Google, they can just change their mind. They can they run the computers. They can just say, no, now there's 22 million, or now here are the rules, or they can change the rules. Just the same way that Facebook changes the rules on their social network. Yeah. So what's interesting from a computing point of view with blockchains is you can encode rules in software and those rules can't change. And so that was, and to do that, you need there's this sort of mechanism that's designed, this kind of, I won't go too much into detail, but there's a computing kind of architecture where you build this virtual computer that sits on a network of physical computers. And then there's this sort of economic game theoretic design that makes it very hard for any of the physical computers to undermine these rules. Okay, that's why you have these things called Bitcoin miners and things. Yeah. So it's basically this kind of very clever system that the original white paper came up with that made it really hard to undermine these commitments. Okay, that's sort of the takeaway. Ethereum came along in 2015 and said, well, what if we take those ideas and generalize them instead of just being a system built as a payment system, a financial service? Let's make it a general purpose computer where anyone can write applications for it. So you can kind of think of it as in the same way the BlackBerry was just sort of for email. And then the iPhone came along and had an app store, right? And so anyone could write anything for it. And that was 2015. That's when I got really excited about it. So I'm like, okay, anyone can write an application for it. Now you're going to unlock all of the creativity in the world. Because I'm a big believer, as I was saying earlier, that software is a creative medium. It's sort of like saying now, here's a word processor, you can write a novel, and 5 billion people, they're going to come up with something interesting. That's kind of my
all right,
my
so
philosophy.
Let me throw this out here and then you can correct me. Yeah. So blockchain is the infrastructure or process. Yeah. Bitcoin is something that's a payment system that's made possible because of that infrastructure of blockchain, and Ethereum is, so Bitcoin is an application of it, and Ethereum is something in between that makes payments and all sorts of other things possible.
Yeah,
Why don't you clarify
basically
further, please?
perfect. The only distinction, so Bitcoin is both a blockchain. So sort of think of it
Mhm.
as like the BlackBerry. It's both a
Yeah.
device but it's a device built for one application. So
Okay.
you're basically 99% right. Just the one nuance is, and then Ethereum is just like an iPhone. It's just a computer, and then you can build stuff. You can write
Great.
applications for it. Anyway, yeah.
Metaphors
So
are the best. Okay.
yeah. Okay.
All right. So I would like to talk about AI just briefly, and
Sure.
in the sense of what's one really practical way that you use it on a day-to-day basis. So like
Yeah.
I just think it's so fascinating to hear, oh, I just needed to, redo my resume, for example, and I used GPT to help me do it. So what's something like practical that you're using AI for on a daily basis?
Yeah. I tried it for writing when I was like working on the book. ChatGPT came out,
Hmm.
and it's like it's good. It's obviously amazing. I mean,
Hmm.
the technology
Hmm.
is amazing, but it just if you're a writer, it wasn't quite there. It was like 80%
Hmm.
of the way there, and so I use it kind of as a search replacement now. I've been using ChatGPT, and lately Claude is kind of interesting. If you tried Claude yet.
Yeah.
And if you want the timely stuff isn't as good. Like a new restaurant in New York, I tried, and it was like my data is not updated or something. But for things like like I was asked, I read a lot, I listen to a lot of history podcasts, and then I always have follow up questions, and I sit there on basically I'm like listening and then like asking the AI questions, and I
Oh,
could probably find that. I'm sure I could find it through searching, but it would be a lot more work and
laborious.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's
yeah.
just really
Mm,
nice how, I mean, I think it's going to certainly change search at a minimum.
mm.
It's just so much better.
Oh,
There's all
yeah.
these other questions because the whole internet is built around the business model of search. So if if you create a content site, you're dependent on the traffic from Google. And if
Mhm.
Google gets replaced with search engines that just give you the answer and don't have links, like it's going to have all these second order consequences.
Oof,
But
very,
yeah,
very disruptive for
yeah,
sure.
but as a user, I will say it just feels like a much better experience. It's actually interesting you asked me this. I'm trying to kind of use AI more in my daily life. I think part of the issue is just and this is going to happen, of course, it needs to be integrated into all the workflows and applications, right?
Yeah,
Because you're sort of like, it's a habit thing. Like, hey, I'm writing an
right.
email.
You're
I don't
over
really
here.
think to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
But
it
I think
does,
that's all going to happen.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's super useful to just be like, okay, I use it of like, I need to have a conversation with so and so about such and such. And I'll be like, here's what I want to say. Can you look at this using the nonviolent communication framework to make sure that I'm saying this in a way that they can hear me? Or can you use, Kim Scott's radical candor? Can you help me frame what I want to say using that? And so that's what I was asking you, is like, what are some things that you're doing just on a daily basis of thinking of like, how do I 10x myself as a person? I think it's exciting and thrilling to think of the
It is.
possibilities.
You know what you can do? We've done this. We haven't released it publicly. Is we took all of our content over 10 years, and I took my book and I trained
Hmm.
an LLM on it.
Yep.
It's really fascinating because you can basically I think I could retire because it's like it knows everything I know. It's scary.
Well,
But
that's good. Then you get the work-life balance that you have been seeking.
I guess so.
Okay, so let's just talk about Clay Christensen for a minute.
Mhm.
You referred to him, and it was interesting hearing sort of this outside in, inside out. It sounds like that sort of there's some influences there from Clayton, but I would just love to hear how he influenced your thinking. Did you know him? I mean, as you know,
Mm.
he was an important mentor for me, and I thought it would be fun just to
Yeah.
hear some reminiscences.
I took his course actually.
You
So
did
I
at
did know.
HBS.
I did. Yeah. I took
I
his
didn't
course,
realize
and I
that.
actually,
Okay.
and he was, and I had the honor to take his course, and of course he's, was a genius and
Hmm.
incredibly great person,
Hmm.
and also spent a lot of. He was so generous with his time. So I did. I was very. I've kind of had the book I wrote. I was sort of interested in the same topics. Obviously, that was 20 years ago, so it was a different world. But I actually a lot of my. I mean, so I it would be. I tried to attribute in the book. I do cite him a
You
bunch,
do,
and I
for
have him
sure.
in the end notes. But I
Yeah.
think probably even more of my thinking, like other parts, I was like, I think this came from Clay Christensen, and I went through his stuff, and then I was like, at some point, I was like, maybe that came from a conversation. So
Hmm.
I think that obviously, the Innovator's Dilemma, I think is probably maybe the greatest tech book. It's just it's so rare that you have these relatively simple. I mean, this
Hmm.
it's really that one graph, right? It's like the rate of things getting
It's that
better versus.
graph for
It's
sure.
that graph, and yet it explains so much, and I think it's misunderstood, right? Because a lot of people think it means like the management is bad. His whole point was the management was good, right? They're listening to their highest profit customers. But then I think there's just, and he wrote some of this and teased it out, but there's all of these follow-on consequences. So I have a section in the book called "Squeezing the Balloon," which really came from him.
So good.
Which
that was really
is,
great.
Yeah, which is this idea that every technology has a tech stack, and there's sort of different layers in the stack. So to give you an example, do you want me to talk about this more? I don't know.
You know what? Yeah, do. That was a great example. And I hadn't, I hadn't ever heard someone explain the value chain piece of it so well. So yeah, touching on that would be interesting.
I'd love to, because I like that part of the book, and it's been, I think, less talked about. I think maybe it's sort of technical or something.
Go ahead.
But and this is mostly his ideas. I'm adding to them. But so basically the way to think about it is every technology exists in a stack. And so what that means is, so think about Google search. So in between, so there's a human and a human is going to Google search. They're clicking on an ad. Google's getting paid for that ad. Maybe the human then goes and buys a product, and that product gets shipped back to the human. So you can kind of think of it like a loop, right? And within that loop, there's a set of technologies. So I'm on a phone. The phone has an operating system. Yeah, I have a web browser. There's a search engine, there's an advertiser, there's a e-commerce site, there's a fulfillment center, and there's a delivery service, right? I'm probably missing payments. There's many more. The way that the tech world works is essentially like Google comes out with search. They're awesome. But then to defend their turf, they need to make sure that they either own or commoditize every layer in that stack, right? And own, of course, means they build a product and they own it. Commoditize means there's basically no value there. For example, the most common way to do that in software is to open source something. And so if you look at Google, like what I just described is exactly their strategy for the last 15 years. So they have a browser, Chrome. They have an operating system, Chrome OS, right? They have devices, Android, they also have Android. They have the Android devices they've now gotten into. Their biggest competitive threat in many ways is Amazon. And this, by the way, everything I'm saying, you don't really hear it in the press. If you actually talk to Google strategy people, they'll say, "Oh yeah, of course, this is how we like." This is this is not original in that sense. It's just sort of not as popularly known. And so basically, the way to look at, and then of course, what happens is Amazon sits at a different place in the stack. But then they need to like defend themselves. So like if you look at Alexa, or if you look like that's their attempt to sort of jump ahead as Google search goes away, they want to own AI, right? Because they're trying to own the device layer. Facebook with VR, they're like, they lost the device layer in this round of the combat, right? And actually that had a huge negative impact. You saw that if you followed a year ago, Apple changed how they do tracking, and Facebook stock dropped like 30%. That's because they don't control the device layer, right? By the way, I think the latest number, so one of the big mistakes Google made was to allow Apple to get so dominant in the operating system world. And so as a result, they paid them, I think the latest report was like $30 billion just last year to be the default search engine on Safari on the iPhone. And so that's an example where Apple is using their leverage at the device layer to squeeze the balloon. And so the squeezing the balloon idea is
show us. Show it to us.
Yeah, so sort of think of a balloon, there's like a fixed amount of air, it's sort of the tech stack, and then you sort of squeezing it, meaning like if you reduce the profits in one area, it ends up going to another area. So it's this idea that, and this is Clay Christensen, I think he called it the conservation of attractive profits. And so, and that of course is an allusion to conservation of energy. Like it's like almost like a law of physics. The idea is there's sort of a certain amount of profits in the tech stack, and that if you kind of reduce profits in one, it increases it in the other. And what's interesting about this, right, is most people think of business as battles between substitutes like Coke and Pepsi, but in fact, in the tech world, that's rare. That matters, Android versus iPhone, like choosing, but a lot of the battles are between the different layers of the tech stack. And if you don't understand that, a lot of sort of product releases and tech news will kind of be puzzling, because that's really where the real competition comes. Because it's tech stacks tend to be zero sum. There's like a dollar, you're fighting over the dollar, right?
So there's a totally different game. There's a totally different it's a chess match. We're actually watching a Korean drama right now because we're big Korean drama fans, and it's called Captivating the King, and it's all about a Go game. And so what you're saying is that as you look at these 5 major companies, there is this Go game happening, and lots and lots and lots of different pieces. And it's not just, no product is in isolation. It's part of a much bigger constellation of pieces.
That's right. And I think what Clayton's his genius, I mean, he had many genius
Mm-hmm.
properties, but one of them was this sort of systems thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was understanding, like it's sort of taking a bunch of things that seem like disparate, complicated things and seeing it as a system.
Mm-hmm.
And that system could be understood if you, and it's sort of like you said, like a game, like what are
Yeah.
the, like he was so good at saying, what are the rules of the game? And when
Mm-hmm.
you understand the rules of the game, suddenly it's sort of like the clouds part and everything becomes easier to understand. Right? I mean, he had many, I think,
Yeah, I'm
many
thinking of this
contributions.
the value chain piece that he talks about and that you were just referring to, and the balloon. I think, you did a wonderful fun video. So everybody, when you buy the book, you can unlock your phone and go to this picture and you have this great video. I think it'd be interesting if you did a second video using those balloons and show people, because I thought that was really very interesting
That's a
and
great
super
idea.
well done. Okay, so as we start to wrap up, and going back to this idea of sort of S curves, you wrote this really great article 15 years ago called "Are You Climbing the Wrong Hill?" Just tell us the gist of that article, because what I loved about it, of course, it had the S curve, but there's also this element of you were really combining your philosophy, your computer science background, and just putting this all together for people. So can you just talk about the gist of that article?
It's funny. I wrote that. This is the way blogging works. I wrote that article. I was sitting in the office and I was talking to this young person who worked for us, and he was talking about how he was sort of at a consulting firm or something, and he wanted to leave and do something else, but felt like he was about to get promoted.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about how I'd seen a lot of people in their career, kind of you get caught on sort of climbing a hill
Mm-hmm.
without thinking too much enough, rather, about which hill you're climbing. And as I was thinking about that, I thought about an analogy to computer science, which is in computer science, there's a whole field around hill climbing. And they call it hill climbing or optimization. It's actually closely related to machine learning. And so the idea is sort of you metaphorically like think of a hilly countryside, and your goal is to get to the top of the highest hill. So that's, in this metaphor, that's your best career realization, right? It's like whatever that might be. And in computer science, so a simple strategy, you drop somewhere is just sort of climb up the hill that you land on, right? Now, of course, that will be good for getting to the top of that hill, but you might be on the wrong hill. And so computer scientists, there's a whole thing called simulated annealing, and there's a bunch of algorithms where basically it turns out the best answer is to do some combination of randomness, sort of meandering around, and then sometimes sort of climbing hills. And so as I was talking to that kid, I thought about it. I was like, wow, that's a lot like the computer science idea. And I whipped off this little blog post, and it turned out to be probably my most popular blog post I ever wrote. That's how blogging works.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
It goes viral like every year or two for some reason. Someone tweets it. Well, it's kind of a timeless. It's like career.
It is. I mean,
but it's just really interesting. So sort of what that would suggest, right, is in your, let's say your 20s, is like, don't just, I think that specifically for people who maybe like listeners, or maybe they're, friends of listeners, if you went to a fancy school and you got a fancy job, there's I think a real danger in just sort of like constantly kind of going up that hill,
staying on Fancy Hill. We have a Fancy Hill near us.
On Fancy Hill, yeah. And like, for example, doing a startup can be really jarring to people who are on the fancy hill, because it's not fancy. You go to a party and you say, I'm X, blah blah startup, like it's not Harvard, and so that can be jarring. And so that's the idea of that blog post, is just that one should add sort of randomness, and that's a lesson that I've taken away from computer science.
I love that randomness. Yeah, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Okay, so what hill are you climbing right now? What's and is it bringing you joy?
I am. Look, I think that hopefully if folks have a chance to read the book, I think they'll see that I'm very passionate about this topic. It's become, I feel like I've spent my career on the internet, and if it ended up leading to, just sort of 5 companies controlling it and to sort of theme parks, that I would be disappointed with that. And so that has given me kind of a mission.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
I believe in it very strongly, and that's. So that kind of motivates me, and I enjoy that.
Okay, so Chris, what's been useful for you in this conversation? It could be something that one of us said, but it also is potentially just something that you thought or observed about yourself in the course of us talking.
I'm not good at self-reflection.
Well, you get to practice right now.
Okay. Well, I thought I love talking about the kind of Clay Christensen stuff, and I feel like it never. Maybe it needs to be repopularized or something, because I don't, for whatever reason, it doesn't come up. I think maybe the new generation of entrepreneurs just haven't fully digested it. But I think that whole kind of framework and the work you do, kind of applying that, to careers and organizations. I think just generally this kind of systems thinking, like I think there's a lot more interesting work to do there. And so I really enjoy talking about those topics.
Love it. Okay. Any final thoughts to wrap this up?
No, I really enjoyed this, and thank you. And I hope if some of these topics are interesting to people. Maybe one last thing I'll say on the book is I worked very, very hard to make the book accessible, non-technical. I think a lot of books are hypey, and
you did.
Obviously people can disagree or agree, but it is meant for, I hope, your audience to, the intro alone, I think, will hopefully kind of summarize the thesis, and I think does it in a clear way. And if that's interesting, one might read more of it. And I also chunked it up. So anyway, I would just love, I'm hoping it'll be something that I don't expect to convince everybody, but I hope it demystifies the topic and explains why people like me are excited about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought it was so well written, and I've done a lot of reading on this. Well, not a lot, but some reading, and there's a lot of hype, and I just felt like it was really useful and practical and understandable. And I don't know, Chris, I would almost say that I don't think this is about. I didn't take this book as you were trying to convince. I took it as you were trying to explain. Here's how you're seeing the world, and here's what you think is important. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Whitney. I appreciate it. Thank you.